This is Danielle Dardashti, host of The Nightingale of Iran, a riveting documentary podcast I made with my sister Galit. Our Jewish grandfather was a radio star in Iran, adored by Muslims. It was a mystery to us why he left during that golden age. We uncovered painful secrets, unspoken for generations. The Nightingale of Iran on all podcast platforms.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 447. High Holidays. Old Man in the Sky? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're talking about the high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Hate to say it because it means summer is basically over, but those 2 days are almost here, and we want to give you a chance to consider how you're going to mark them before they sneak up on us in early October. So we've lined up conversations with some of our most favorite Unbound spiritual leaders to explore the themes of the high holidays with us and to think about how to make all of our experiences of them more meaningful. Our first guest in this run of High Holiday episodes is Zvika Krieger. He's the spiritual leader of Chokhmat Halev in Berkeley, California. He's a longtime friend of ours, but a first-time guest on this show. Zvika Krieger as an individual and his community more generally do all kinds of experimenting with Jewish rituals, so we're excited to explore his approach to meaning-making during this pretty pivotal time of the Jewish calendar year. Before we dive in, just a reminder that the Unyeshiva, our digital center for Jewish learning and unlearning, is offering a whole slew of awesome classes that, like this episode, can help you gear up for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We have a full semester class called Judaism Inbound that serves as an introduction to Judaism, and it's open to Jews, non-Jews, and anyone on the precipice between the two. We also have 4 mini courses. Each of them are 3 sessions long, and they explore topics ranging from Hasidism to the binding of Isaac, to the Kol Nidre prayer, to the month of Elul. That's the month we're in right now, the month directly preceding the high holidays. You can sign up for any of these classes at judaismunbound.com/classes. Financial aid is available, and by the time we get to next week's episode of Judaism Unbound, a lot of these classes are going to have started, so now is the time to sign up. Don't miss it. judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more and register. So now for today's conversation, a few words about our guest today, Zvika Krieger. The community that Zvika Krieger leads, Chokhmat Halev, is a progressive spiritual community in Berkeley, California for embodied prayer and mindfulness, mystical wisdom, and heart-centered connections. Zvika Krieger is also the co-founder of Shevet, Jewish Mindfulness Collective, and he served in board and leadership positions for Sukkot Shalom Milk and Honey Camp at Burning Man, Jewish Studio Project, and DC Minyan. In addition to his work in the Jewish community, Zvika Krieger has spent time in the tech sector, working to mitigate some of the most damaging impacts of new technologies on individuals and society. He was Facebook Meta's first ever director of responsible innovation. He created and led the World Economic Forum's Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. He was the U.S. Department of State's first ever ambassador to Silicon Valley, and he also served as senior strategist in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, served as senior vice president of the Center for Middle East Peace, was an editor and writer at The Atlantic and The New Republic, and he was Newsweek's Middle East correspondent based in Egypt and Lebanon, covering most of the Arab world. Zvika Krieger has a BA from Yale University. He trained as an ecstatic dance DJ with embodied sound, is an ordained rabbi in the Hasidic lineage, and will soon be receiving rabbinical ordination from Aleph, the Alliance for Jewish Renewal, which is where Lex has his rabbinical ordination from. Zvika Krieger is not only a student, he has also taught courses in design, technology, and social impact at Stanford, UC Berkeley, and the Rhode Island School of Design. Most importantly, Zvika Krieger is a chavruta, that's a study partner of Lex's, and a dear friend and collaborator of mine in this wild ecosystem of Jewish innovation and experimentation. So, Zvika Krieger, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you. And although we usually don't start the podcast with apologies, we want to offer you and our audience our belated apology that despite each of us having a lot of really great conversations with you in the past, somehow they have not yet been featured on this podcast.
Yeah, I feel like I've been on the show already, A, because I spend so much time nerding out with the two of you in so many other contexts, and because I'm such an avid fanboy. So honored to be here on the show.
So the feeling is mutual, and we're excited to talk today with you about the high holidays. And it strikes me that, a lot of people talk about this idea that, oh, the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. A lot of rabbis say stuff like that. And yet most Jews show up at the high holiday services, often the only service that they show up at. And the God that we're talking about at the high holiday services sounds a lot like the God that this rabbi generally says we don't believe in. It's with the language is our father, our king, and there's all kinds of ideas about somebody recording our good deeds and our bad deeds and balances and all that. And I guess I'm curious how you come to a holiday like that from a different point of view and deal with the fact that we have all of these prayers and all this language.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely boggles my mind that, the one day a year that so many people come to synagogue, like the conception of God in most traditional liturgy is totally non-resonant to modern day folks. But I would say that the God of the high holidays liturgy is particularly non-resonant and particularly challenging with all this language around judging and being judged. Like it is ironic that the one time of year that many people come, they're confronted with a particularly non-resonant conception of God. It's funny because most people expect, because people who know me know that I grew up Orthodox and like very immersed in Jewish tradition, Jewish text, Jewish liturgy, praying 3 times a day. And so they assume that I had this like very well thought out relationship to God, that I always knew what to do with this non-resonant liturgy. And I think what most people don't realize about Orthodox Judaism, or I'll say like most versions of Orthodox Judaism, and certainly the version of Orthodox Judaism that I grew up in, is that God is actually not very present. It's actually not a very, like, I did not have a very spiritual or spiritually rich religious life growing up, because at least in the world that I grew up in, so much of it was focused on rote halakha, Jewish law, like observance of Jewish law, that I was, so busy focused on all the things we had to get done every day, that God was almost like besides the point. Like God was not a character in my life. And I do remember at a certain point when I was in yeshiva and in Jewish seminary, asking a rabbi of mine, like basically admitting to a rabbi of mine, like, oh, like, I don't know if I can do this sort of version of Judaism because I'm struggling with believing in God. And he actually said to me, well, what does God have to do with anything? like it's actually like, what does believing in God have to do with this like whole corpus of thousands of pages of text that sort of circumscribe your life? Like God is actually not relevant to that. So I actually like didn't grow up with a very resonant conception of God, and actually had to spend a lot of my time in my 20s and in my 30s and in rabbinical school actually figuring out, like, what do I do with this God, this conception of God in liturgy? And frankly, let's be honest, in the Torah, like the God of the Torah is not particularly resonant as well. And so how do we like I actually like that's something that has only come to me later in life.
So I guess my question then maybe it's both about a little bit of ethnography of Orthodoxy, but more importantly is how you think about it today. So we come to this high holiday service and there's so much God. It's all about God. All these prayers are about God is doing this, God is doing that. So I guess my ethnography question is, what do Orthodox people think is going on? If they're not really that focused on God, what do they imagine those prayers are about? Are they really paying much attention to the words or not? Maybe one way into this question for you is, if everything in our ancient literature, in our liturgy, even the idea of God, if it's a metaphor, what is it a metaphor for? So basically, like if we're coming to high holiday services and we're reading all these things that say God, 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 judgment, this and that, and we understand them like it's just a metaphor. Okay, great. I can get into that, but tell me what it's a metaphor for.
So first of all, in terms of like, well, what do Orthodox people do who do theoretically understand what they're praying? I don't claim to speak on behalf of all Orthodox people, but based on my own experience and the experience of people who I've talked to about this topic, one is that like there are some people who do take it literally. Like they actually do believe that there is a bearded man sitting on a throne in the sky who's judging us. And you see the fervence with which some people are praying with like tears in their eyes and sweat dripping down their face because they actually believe that there is a man on a throne who's listening to their prayers and that like will actually change the course of their year based on how hard they pray and how fervently they pray, and will be swayed by that. If you believe that, then like, yeah, you got to pray your ass off because it matters. And so I think that is part of it. But I don't think that's true for all Orthodox Jews. And I would say in a weird way, there's actually it's a similar dynamic for Orthodox and progressive Jews. I don't think either of them are actually really paying attention to what they're saying. That is surprising because I think that Orthodox Jews have much stronger grasp of Hebrew than, I mean, that's a stereotype, obviously, but I'd say like by and large, Orthodox Jews have more understanding of Hebrew than more progressive folks. But the flip side is that Orthodox Jews tend to pray a lot more. Like they tend to pray like hundreds of pages every day. And so we call it the mumble bubble, right? Where you're just like, like you're trying to get through like thousands of lines of text. And so like, you don't have time to actually like really take in what you're praying. And I think for like progressive Jews, like most of them don't understand what they're saying in Hebrew. And to the extent that they're praying in English, I'll sort of out myself and say, I've actually never been to a Reform synagogue before in my life. And so I don't, or Reconstructionist, since I don't actually know what happens there. But, to the extent that like a lot of the prayers are in English, like they either kind of
But just to clarify, because you are the leader of a renewal congregation, which is not those, but is adjacent to those.
Right. And it's kind of like where like Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism kind of come together on the back end of the spectrum. But, my sense is that just, I've read some Reform prayer books is that, they still use words like my Lord, my King, things like that, that even people in English who read in English, like don't really think that much about the words. And so to sort of get back to your question, like, why do we do this? Right. And I think that part of it is this sense of, I don't know if it's nostalgia or like a sort of craving for authenticity in some perverse way. Like the less resonant the words are, the more authentic they feel, right? It's like, oh, this is clearly from a bygone era that is not our era. It's from like the Renaissance kind of medieval period where there was kings and knights and vassals and things. And so it must be really authentic. And so we're doing something very old and sacred and meaningful. And so like the less resonant it is in some ways, like the more it touches on that like nostalgia or authenticity button in our hearts. And maybe nostalgia is not just for like some bygone era, but also like a lot of people grew up going to synagogues with this kind of non-resonant conception of God, but like they're there because they just want to recreate the warm and fuzzy memories of their childhood, or they want to like be loyal to their parents and grandparents. And so like the keeping of that same liturgy actually has an important role for them to play on the nostalgia front as well.
Yeah, and I think an open question, I fully agree diagnostically with what you just said, and I think you and I spoke about this once. I'll never forget, this guy posted in a Facebook group a number of years ago asking for a recommendation for a place to go for high holidays in whatever city he was in. And he specifically said, I want the most old school, like responsive reading, out-of-date prayer book. Like I want the one that is like that. Because I want the feeling, I don't even need it to like speak to me spiritually. I want that nostalgia. I want that feeling of kind of what I had growing up, which I noted and thought like, that's interesting, right? I don't love it, but I do think that is what many people want with high holidays. I want to sit a little bit more with like what happens in a lot of Jewish spaces for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, because I think the easy way out is to talk only about how the liturgy isn't resonant. I mean, all of what you said about God is super true. Literally, I'll never forget, in most prayer books, there's this bolded part of the Hebrew that says, Hamelech Yoshev al Kisei Ram v'Nisa, and it's bolded. It's like extra important and chanted a certain way. And if we were going to distill the theology that people say they don't have Jewishly, it would be that. It is literally the king sitting on an elevated, which is to say high heavenly throne. It is actually the man, and it's gendered male. So it is in fact the man in the sky on a throne. So we have that issue. But I don't think it's just that. And I think that you're at a space, Chokhmat Halev, which is interesting in that you don't share necessarily some of the other tried and true methodologies of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is to say a lot of places, the expectation is that there's basically a couple clergy at the front of the room doing most of the doing, and everybody else is maybe saying Amen, maybe reading along in English or occasionally in Hebrew. It's very frontal. I see people joke about how they like bring side reading to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because they get so bored in the pews, and it's actually normalized and okay. And maybe that's good to read a novel you brought.
I do that, by the way.
Yeah, and like that's fine. But like, I guess my question is, no, like, and I, as a kid, I remember myself doing that. My mom was like fine with it. And like, there's a part of me that thinks that's actually kind of cool that we normalize that in Jewish space. Another part of me thinks like we should have more compelling stuff happening that everybody wants to do. But suffice to say, what besides just the liturgy would you shine a light on with how high holidays happen? And I'm not just asking about Orthodox. I know that's a predominant space you spent time in, but like what's going right and what's going less right with how we go about high holidays generally, not just the liturgy?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say that I definitely had a group of friends for many years that we would crowdsource what we called our high holiday reader, where we would each pick like 2 or 3 articles, and then we would print it out and actually bind it so that we each had our like copy of like 15 articles that we didn't get a chance to read over the course of the year from like different magazines. And so I was definitely in that boat for many years. But I want to answer your immediate question, Lex, which is the liturgy is very problematic, but it's actually only one tool in the toolkit. If you're overly indexed on liturgy, or I guess the meaning of the liturgy, that's like an inherently cerebral approach to prayer, right? Where you're saying like, prayer needs to resonate intellectually for me in order for it to be meaningful. And there are a lot of people whose primary language is, or primary kind of modality for connection to things is cerebrally. I mean, we're Jews, hello. But there are other ways to sort of connect to the divine or to have a sort of heart-opening experience or to have some sort of transformational experience. And so I think obviously key in Chokhmat Halev is far from unique in this is music, right? That music is like, and sometimes people sort of diminish music as kind of like, oh, that's just kind of like the superficial trappings to like make the liturgy more palatable. But I think there's a reason why the most successful synagogues are the ones that have the best music and the most beautiful music, because like music is a spiritual and sacred experience, and it can transport you and take you places in ways that are completely removed from the words that you are singing. You know, I just finished watching, or I'm in the middle of watching this 4-part documentary series about Hillsong Church. It's like one of the most, the largest evangelical churches in the world. And like so much of the success of Hillsong is their music, right? Like they have like many, like they've won Grammy Awards for their music. And so recognizing the transformational and transportational, I don't know if that's a word, the transportative quality of music. I also think embodiment is really important. And we actually do have a lot of Jewish technologies for embodiment. Dancing is just one of them. And like, that's one of the things that like Chokhmat Halev is famous for. And I wish other synagogues would do it, but like people get out of their chairs and dance, right? And just kind of like move their bodies. And that is a way for me. I mean, like dance has been a really important part of my personal spiritual practice. I go to ecstatic dance multiple times per week because I am such a cerebral person, and to get out of my head and into my body, like I need, like dance is an important way to do that. And I think there's like a wisdom in our bodies that is separate from the wisdom of our brains. On high holidays, we have a unique type of embodiment that used to be a fixture in Jewish prayer, but now we only do it once a year, which is called nefilat apayim, falling on your face. Like that used to be like one of our core prayer postures where you would actually prostrate fully on the floor. And we do nefilat apayim multiple times in our service, including one time we have people lying on the floor, prostrated on their face over half an hour, because there is something just like inherently vulnerable, humility inducing, like it actually just like activates totally different parts of your nervous system So, music, embodiment, silence, meditation, mindfulness, and we can double click on any of these things. I feel like I'm giving a bit of a laundry list here. And then like, I guess the last thing, having some sort of interactivity, right? Like so much of traditional prayer services are a rabbi or a chazan prayer leader who's standing on the bima, who's standing on the stage. Even the fact that like bima is translated as stage, right, implies that that it's a performance and that people are watching, and it's unidirectional, and maybe it's responsive, but the responsiveness is from a pre-written script. We put in our service at Chokhmah, we have so many moments where like, anytime there's a sermon, we give like 10 minutes where people actually get into pairs and say, okay, the rabbi just gave you this teaching. Like, what do you think about this? Or what did it stir up in you? Or like, we have like this process of creating like bait deans where people get into groups of 4 and people set intentions for the year, or they nullify their vows they made for the year that came from a place of emptiness or a place of wanting, so that they can enter the new year from a place of wholeness. And so like, having these interactive activities are like another way that you can break up the monotony, but it just shows that like liturgy is just one of the many things in our quiver.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that you're getting at with something like breaking up a space into we're gonna schmooze with our neighbor for 10 minutes. I've been reflecting a lot lately about my own relationship to formality and informality. I've actually been like psychoanalyzing myself a lot, but I think part of why Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur have been so hard for me is that of all Jewish holidays, they are the far extreme end on the formality front in every respect. People dress up a very grand kind of posture. And then most contexts, you're sitting in rows and oriented where like disrupting the service and talking with your neighbor. Look, I hope that there are many contexts like yours that do that, but my experiences growing up were certainly not that, where you would have like, oh yeah, we're going to break open the space and we're going to schmooze a little. It's going to be back and forth. Like that would be very much, maybe on a Shabbat that might happen. But on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, like, no. We're in grand mode. And I don't like grand mode personally. Like all of my favorite spiritual experiences are spiritual experiences that like break open via interruption or via back and forth, and it's omnidirectional as opposed to unidirectional. It's like different people bouncing off of each other through a group conversation, or even through harmonies in a room of people sitting in a circle versus in rows that are faced one direction. Like all of that makes the space less formal. And so part of my struggle with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur has been that side. And so because you opened it up, I'm curious to hear your reflections on that, because on the one hand, like bowing fully to the ground, which is actually a practice I do myself, that is kind of grand. I think it's a big gesture to do. And when a community does it as a whole, it can be very powerful. And on the other side, decompressing a sermon for 10 minutes and making that as important as the sermon itself is a different kind of ritual act. So how would you think about that formality kind of axis?
People want different things, and it's impossible to create a prayer service that meets everyone. And I used to be a product designer, and we used to always say, when I used to teach design, I used to always tell my students, if you're designing for everyone, you're designing for no one, right? If you're creating a service that's got like little pieces for everyone, you're going to piss some people, everyone's going to get a little bit annoyed and no one's going to feel fully satisfied. And so I've given up, as a spiritual leader, like I've given up the pretense of creating a service that caters to everyone. And like, I've got like more of like a casual, colloquial, like vibe. And some people don't like that. And like when I became the spiritual leader of my current community, like some people left because they were just like, who's this guy? He's like way too casual. He's way too friendly. Like I want my rabbi to be like sage on the stage kind of vibe. And I'm like, that's cool. It's just not my vibe. And so like we need, let 1,000 synagogues bloom, like we need lots of different models. And so like I take definitely like the more, even though like even our high holidays do have this kind of grandiosity to it. Nobody wears suit and tie, but everyone wears white. That's like our vibe. And so it creates a different kind of grandiosity to it. But I do want to say like just one thing I sort of left off my list of like other modalities or other tools we have in our quiver is like the service itself is just one tool. a lot of communities spend a lot of time thinking about the service, but they don't think about what happens before the service, what happens after the service, right? Like we set up right outside our service, like we're setting up a big tea lounge, which is, that's like a sort of Bay Area sort of hippie thing, but like, where people can then just come after services. You don't have to rush home, but you can actually sit and get a cup of tea and sit on cushions with a circle of people and actually debrief what happened, like what came up for you during the service, metabolize it, analyze it. Something may have resonated with you, but like something didn't resonate, but then you meet someone and you talk to them afterwards and they're like, that didn't land on me that way. That's like a great perspective. And then, like we do these like potluck dinners where like for the second night of Rosh Hashanah, anyone who signed up for high holiday tickets can then get sort of seated at a dinner, intergenerational, with people that they don't know. And like part of the focus is like, let's actually debrief what happened in high holiday during services at dinner, so that you can actually continue the conversation. So it doesn't all have to be like, oh, like, let's break out into pairs during the service. I get it. Like not every synagogue has that kind of vibe. Create spaces after services to debate and discuss and internalize and what came up for you during the service. I have like kind of like a happy hour, one the week after Rosh Hashanah, one the week after Yom Kippur, so that people can come and like discuss with me. Like, yeah, it's hard to like have a discussion. Like your rabbi just gave a sermon. You want to ask, there's not like usually a Q&A after the sermon, but like schedule time like a couple days later to like get into that back and forth so that you can actually dig deeper into things that you can only fit so much in a 4-hour block.
4 hours. Whew. I'll trust you. I'll trust you that it'll be magical.
So let's talk about both where you're coming from and where Chokhmat Alev, the institution that you lead, is coming from. And maybe they're the same now because all the people who wanted something else have left and now you're in complete control. But I wanted to understand, like when we're talking about the high holidays, what is driving all the approaches that you're talking about? In other words, what do you think the high holidays are there to do for people?
Yeah, so, Chokhmat Alev is an interesting community. It's very much a creature of the Bay Area in the sense that it's a place for spiritual seekers, right? It started off as a Jewish meditation center 30 years ago. Actually, this fall, we are celebrating our 30th anniversary of our first ever high holiday services, which is where we kind of sprang up from. And it's very much, a lot of people who came from more Eastern traditions, Boo Jews, jargon for people who are Buddhist and Jewish, and people who like really are looking for spiritual depth, who are looking for transcendence, who are looking to their religion for like deep nourishment, meaning. And I realized that like that's actually like I take it for granted that that's why people come to Jewish community. And the more I kind of get out and talk to colleagues who are sort of working in other communities, like it's actually not why many people go to synagogue. I don't want to take that for granted. And I feel very fortunate to be in a synagogue that's why most people are coming. But like a lot of people go to synagogue because it's community, or they go to socialize, or they go to like feel, to do social justice, or they go to do community service, and a lot of people come for politics, right? Like they want to hear the rabbi's drash on what's happening in Israel-Palestine, or what's happening with, Trump versus Harris, right? Like who should they vote for? Like, that's not me, and it's definitely not my community, but like that was true before I even got there. And so that very much informs like why I think people are coming. And I think that people are looking for like an oasis in their busy lives, like somewhere to come to where they can actually pause, reflect on the past year, what's happened. Like what's nice about high holidays is they happen once a year, and they happen at the same time, approximately the same time every year. So it's actually like a great mile marker to be like, I was sitting in this exact seat a year ago. Here's what I was afraid of. Here's what I was excited about. And it's actually kind of cool to reflect and be like, this thing that I was afraid of didn't come to pass, or it did, and it wasn't so bad. And now I'm on the other end of it. Like I remember sitting in high holidays one year when I was getting divorced and feeling totally devastated about the fact that I was getting divorced. And then I remember coming back a year later and being like, okay, I'm still sad and I'm still grappling with that, and I'm okay. Like my life is pretty good, and I've moved past that, and it's opened up all these other blessings that sitting here a year ago I never would have thought of, and so or I never would have envisioned or imagined. And so there is, I think, the technology of high holidays no matter what liturgy you use, no matter what modalities you use, the fact that it is sort of baked into the ethos of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is reflection of the past year. And the fact that we come to the same place every year and we carve out time and space to do that, there's a certain efficacy of the technology that can't be undermined by all the shitty stuff of the tradition that's caked around it.
Okay, so given that, can you sort of break down the technology that you use? I mean, you were giving us examples earlier about breaking up people into fours and talking about the vows and what vows they want to be relieved of for the next year because this and that. So you described some really interesting, both old and new technologies, and I'm curious if you could connect those and the objectives that you're describing. Like, is it working?
Yeah, well, I think if you'll allow me, I'll use this as like a way back to your original question, Dan, of like, what are these metaphors? And like, when we're looking at traditional liturgy, you basically have two options. You can either be like, okay, this was written a long time ago. It's not resonant. We're getting rid of it, right? You can junk it. And there's definitely a lot of communities that do that, including many, some people who you may have coming on your show to talk about this. And then the second choice, or I guess you have three choices. The second choice is just to use the old non-resonant liturgy and just kind of surrender any pretense of relevance and just rely on the music or the nostalgia or whatever it may be. And the third is like, let's dig deeper. Like, let's actually excavate this liturgy and figure out maybe there is some resonance that is there beneath the surface. And I'm more in that sort of third category, because I just actually like the challenge of trying to find resonance in things that on their face may not seem resonant. And I would say that is a distinctive element of the Jewish renewal tradition that maybe differentiates it from other progressive denominations. But like, I think there is something, I mean, I know I sort of quasi derisively dismissed it earlier as nostalgia, but like, there is something about like, like our ancestors were praying with this text for like hundreds and in some cases thousands of years. Like, that's kind of cool. First of all, like, I like feeling connected to my ancestors. Like, there's like a potent, almost like magic to that. But I think like going back to this sort of core metaphor that you brought up, Lex, around like king sitting on a throne, sort of judging us, like that is actually like not inherent to Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. Like if you look in the Torah as the source for Rosh Hashanah, it doesn't actually say anything about judgment. It just says it's, in the 7th month on the 1st day of the month. And so like, by the way, not even the new year. So, we can come back to why that is. Yelachem Shabbaton, like it should be a day of rest for you. So like, that could be like an interesting thing to kind of orient high holidays around. Certainly not what most people orient high holidays around. And then the only thing it says in the Torah about what Rosh Hashanah is, it says Zikaron Trua Mikra Kodesh. Right? It's a sacred occasion, Mikra Kodesh, or like a calling in of holiness, and Zikaron Trua, like remembering or remembrance of the blasts. And so like blowing the shofar is actually like pretty much and we don't even saying that Rosh Hashanah is holiday of blowing the shofar is even a sort of leap from that line. But to the extent that it's mentioned in that line, it's kind of actually the only thing that we know about Rosh Hashanah from the Torah. And so I just want to make that point, right? That like Rosh Hashanah and this like idea of judgment is not inherent to the day of Rosh Hashanah. And the source for that is that we have this Mishnah, which is the oral text, right? That the rabbinic text that came and was codified after the destruction of the Second Temple, essentially a completely different religion from the religion that existed before that. But I will resist the temptation to go down that rabbit hole. That basically the source for our holiday that we call Rosh Hashanah, again, the name Rosh Hashanah does not appear in the Torah, but the holiday that we now call Rosh Hashanah it comes first in the Mishnah. And it basically says in the Mishnah that there are 4 days on the year in which we are judged. There's like, I think it's like Pesach, Passover, we're judged for the grain. Shavuot, we're judged for the fruit. Sukkot, we're judged for the water. And then it says on Rosh Hashanah, there's this phrase that says that, all creatures pass in front of the divine like B'nai Maron. And like, I'm specifically not translating that yet. That's sort of the root, because the sort of traditional translation is B'nai Maron is sheep, and that we sort of pass in front of the divine like sheep. And then the Talmud then says, okay, well, what's the source for this? Like, where do we actually know that on Rosh Hashanah? Because it doesn't say it in the Torah around the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. And so they basically quote this verse from Psalms to prove that Rosh Hashanah is the day of judgment. And it basically says God is the one who fashions our hearts together, and hamevin et al kol ma'asehem, that God is the one who understands all of our actions. And I think it's interesting that the rabbis choose to translate this as judgment, right? That we are being judged, because the phrase that they gleam onto is hamevin et kol ma'asehem. There is this divine understanding of all of our actions. And so to me, like, Rosh Hashanah is not judgment day, it's understanding day. And so like getting back to your question, Dan, about how do we make sense of these metaphors? How do we find resonance? Like, I don't refer to Rosh Hashanah as judgment day. Like, I refer to it as like understanding day, and that this idea, not of a God who, to the extent that you think of a God as like this separate being that is like has feelings and does things, like I don't think of God in that way. And I think in many ways, Judaism does not think of God in that way. But if you're looking for a metaphor of like a sort of being that is sort of all powerful and all knowing, I much prefer this metaphor of somebody who's like sitting on high, so has like a full view of our lives, right? Who sees us in all of our complexity, that like generally like we go about our lives and like we have our friends that see us one way, we have our family, we have our coworkers, and like there's nobody in our lives who like fully sees like a 360-degree picture of us. And that there is this God that actually sees us in our full complexity. Like, that's actually like a pretty powerful image. I think in many ways, like, it's a very human yearning to be seen in our full complexity, when like most people only see one piece of us. That just feels like so much more nourishing to me than the idea of a judge on a throne who's sort of litigating us and issuing a judgment. And so that's just like an example of like going back to like, okay, like what do our sources say about this, rather than defaulting to like simplistic imagery that's in a lot of the liturgy that was written a lot later.
Yeah, I mean, I love that speaks to you. I will say, like, it sounds to me like the description you just made about and gave a beautiful window into is just like surveillance. It's like a God that is
Yes.
like sitting at a monitor in a back room at some big complex, looking at a bunch of like. It doesn't endear me to God that God is able to zoom out and have like like you talked about how, okay, God is like up. And so it gives a vantage point where God has perspective. Like, I don't, that doesn't speak to, I'm not saying it shouldn't speak to anyone else. I'm just like being honest. And I think that it goes to what you said, which is that like neither you nor I is as excited about a God that is external from us and who does things to us. Neither of us is as excited about that as we are about a notion of God that is actually sort of the sum total of all existence. That's something that speaks to me more. And that kind of, I want to dwell there because, again, we have this issue with the holiday. To some extent, it's that the thesis statement it has is one that doesn't speak to a lot of people. And to the extent that Rosh Hashanah has a thesis statement, I think it's basically that there is this majestic, I mean, the word majesty or malchuyot in Hebrew, like, is core to the holiday. There is this God that is powerful, that makes decisions about us, that has power that we're trying to relate to. And the other thesis statement is that, like, it's a new year. But I feel like the other thing is not so much that the holidays' core statements don't speak to us. It's that we don't even focus on the holidays' core statements. Right. Like, there's so much liturgy. Like, we have all of the liturgy we say in a lot of the daily liturgy for the whole year is, like, much of it is retained. We have all sorts of insertions for Rosh Hashanah that like are related to that day in particular. Then we even have like poetic writings that have been accumulated over centuries and millennia that different folks wrote. The people just thought, oh, this is a great poem, and oh, it's a cool notion of God. We're going to throw that into, like, we have so many competing things happening that we're actually not noticing a thesis statement at all. Like, it's not at all clear to me that most people going to a Rosh Hashanah service walk out with a sense of like, here's the ritual act I just did. Whereas with Passover, it's like, I just spent a while thinking about the exodus from Egypt and the journey from slavery to freedom. With Purim, I related to the story of Esther and Mordechai and the king and Haman, and the Jews were almost destroyed and then they're not. With Tu B'Shvat even, it's simple enough that it's like, okay, we're celebrating trees and fruit today. Rosh Hashanah, it's like overwhelming. And so part of me wants to ask, like, you mentioned the folks who want to ditch it all, who want to discard it all. I think I am, to some degree, part of that camp in my dream world. It's not what I've actually done in communities where I've led, because that's not usually what they ask me to do. But like, can we talk a little bit more about what might we want to think through from scratch? What might we want to reorganize or reorient so that whatever the goals of Rosh Hashanah are, we actually achieve them, as opposed to like launching a lot of different kavanot, a lot of different intentions into a stew and seeing what happens?
I'm happy to get into that. But before we get into that, I do want to just come back to the first point that you made, which is maybe just like any metaphor for God that sort of paints God as like a being are not resonant. And like, I'm actually kind of with you on that, right? And I think that like, what is the purpose of metaphor? And I want to really give a shout out to Tova Spitzer's new book, Rabbi Tova Spitzer, God is Here. And she has a whole chapter about like, what is the purpose of metaphor, right? And we have this core tension in Judaism where on the one hand, we have all these images of God, God as king, God as judge, God as father, God as wellspring, God as fire, all of these conceptions of God. But then we also have this very core conception in Jewish theology that like God is infinite. And that it's actually like, you actually cannot describe God. God is like inherently undescribable. And any desire to like attribute human characteristics to God is blasphemous, right? Like you look at Maimonides' core conception of God and like, forget the liturgy, like the Torah, right? There is a personified version of God that gets angry, that gets jealous, right? And so like, how do you square this like inherent contradiction of like, God is totally undescribable and infinite, and we have these like very concrete things. And the way that one way to square those two is that all of these tangible manifestations of God, including the God character of the Torah, is a metaphor. And they're actually meant to evoke in us a certain feeling. And that feeling is meant to be sort of a gateway to connecting with that infinite of the divine, plugging into the oneness, which is how I define God and how like most of the Jewish mystics define God, right? That God is actually just the sum total of everything that is, was, and ever will be. Like that is God. All of existence is God. Then like these metaphors are meant to evoke feelings in us that then open us up to plugging into the oneness. Maybe the idea of this like God is like the understander, feeling the sense of feeling fully understood or fully seen in your complexity. Maybe that resonates with you, maybe it doesn't, but like all of these are metaphors. And I think that when we look at like the liturgy, for example, like, the word for God that we probably say most often in the liturgy is Adonai, right? Baruch atah Adonai. And Adonai translates as my Lord or my master, which I think does not resonate for most people. But there's this amazing midrash teachings of the rabbis that, theoretically were handed down from Moses at Sinai to kind of like explain the gaps in the Torah. But there's this amazing midrash where basically God says to Adam, go and name every creature on the planet. So Adam goes and gives every animal, every creature a name. And then God says to Adam, now it's your turn to name me. And Adam says, your name is Adonai because you are the master of the universe. And I love this story, this midrash, because it's like, God did not ever tell us that God was Adonai. God did never say, I am the master of the universe. I'm a king. I'm a judge who sort of lords over you. Like we created that. Human beings created that conception. And so I think that like, I feel very comfortable dispensing with that notion, knowing that it very much is a human creation. But then the question is like, where do we go from there? God is none of these metaphors. These metaphors are meant to evoke a certain feeling in us. But then the question is like, why are we praying? Right? Because like you asked the question, Lex, prayer is actually maybe the wrong thing to be doing because like just like the notion of prayer is such a non-resonant thing for most people. And to many people, it's inherently tied to like, there's a king on a throne that you're praying to. And that's why so many people bring their books or their printed out articles because like they don't connect to the concept of prayer. And so I think the question that we need to be asking is like, what is the point of prayer? Right? Like if there is no old man in the sky who's listening for our prayers and then changing the switchboard based on our prayers and like changing our lives, like why are we praying? If we don't answer that question, then like, what are we doing here? If you don't believe in a God who listens to you and actually changes the world based on your prayers, like what kind of kabuki dance are you participating in here if you don't actually believe in a God that listens to what you're saying?
So what's the answer?
I think part of the answer is that prayer is not for God. Prayer is for us. Like there's that phrase, like dance like nobody's watching. I like to say, like, pray like nobody's listening, right? Because nobody is listening. Surprise. Hate to tell you that Santa Claus is not real, but like nobody's listening. Like the inherent paradox of like God being the most powerful person in the world, if that's the metaphor you believe in, but they actually need your prayer to like in order to be convinced to do things. It's like a paradox that like if you think about it for more than a second, you'll realize that it doesn't make any sense. And like even the word to pray in Hebrew, lehit palel, is in the reflexive format. It's something that you do to yourself, right? And palel, like that root of lehit palel, means to clarify. And so it's you're actually clarifying something to yourself. And so I do think that there is something powerful about articulating what you want, what you hope for, what you dream for, what you're calling in, even if nobody's listening.
So I really love the intention of pray like nobody's listening, but I'm like, I want people to pray like no God is listening. And
right.
and here I mean God in the sense that you and I are saying doesn't resonate with us. I think the word God conveys to most people external being that can receive prayer and then change responses and sort of make your life better or worse based on those prayers. Like pray like no God is going to do that as a result of your prayers. I agree with that. But if I were to answer why I pray, well, first off, I'm not sure that I pray. I get in rooms that are called prayer or services. I don't know that the primary action or verb I'm doing is praying because I'm not really petitioning for things. Like the word pray does kind of connect to asking for stuff, requesting things. And I don't know that what I'm doing when I get in a room full of Jews and their loved ones to do a thing together on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that I'm praying. I do want people to pray like other people are listening, in the sense that what I'm doing when I gather with that group and why I want to be sitting in circles and not in rows, and why I want to be omnidirectional, connecting to as many different kinds of people in the room as I can and not just monodirectional, is that I am practicing what I hope is the core spiritual action I do every day. I am practicing what it is to connect to that which is beyond myself. So you talked about how lehit palel is, and I don't think we're contradicting each other, but like you talked about how this is a reflexive verb. Pray yourself. It's like it's a word that relates to something you do to yourself. I agree. And what I do in a micro format, in a room full of 20 or 50 or 200 people praying together, is I am trying musically and verbally and even in body language and otherwise, I'm trying to have myself be in alignment, to have myself be part of a broader whole. And the reason why I think that matters in my life is because when I leave that room, when I spend time in my neighborhood or in my state or in my country or in my planet, I want to be somebody who practices and achieves the act that is congealing myself to the broader collective that is my neighborhood or even my family or my group that I'm part of. And so prayer is a practice. We talk about practices and we forget that that's like a verb that means you're actually practicing for something, doing something once or twice, and then you hopefully do it afterwards. I'm not practicing asking God for stuff or even articulating praise to God. I'm practicing singing with a room full of people, listening. This is where I do want people to listen to others while they're praying. Like looking for what needs to be contributed. If there's a lull in the melody, being a little louder. If it's getting too high voltage, finding the place for silence. Like that's what I think is happening in a prayer space. My question is it realistic that we can do that effectively in a room of, you mentioned thousands or even hundreds of people? Like, because part of me thinks like, if we talk about like self-improvement and teshuvah, maybe we should all go to synagogues and like practice apologizing to each other and like go around the room and spend 4 hours doing that. Like, would that achieve a different purpose, or why should we not go that direction?
Well, I think it's important that we contextualize what's happening in the synagogue, right? Like, I don't think that it's the prayers or the rituals that are they themselves ill-suited to what we're trying to accomplish. It's the rote way in which we perform them and the lack of like kavanah, of intention setting when we do them. Like, I mean, on the practical level, like we hand out these, we call them al-khait sheets, which is basically like fill in like a sheet where people can actually write in. People take time by themselves in quiet contemplation to sort of write down all the ways in which they feel like they missed the mark this year.
That's
and
amazing.
then we anonymize them, or you don't write your name on it. And then we like bundle them up. And then throughout the service, people come up. We take these like 2-minute interludes where people actually read out what's on those sheets, anonymized. So it's not just like this like random list of Hebrew words where you're banging your chest, but it's actually like, these are things that someone in this room wrote down today, right? That like we are actually reflecting on. I want to come back to that point you were making about prayer and actually just take it one step further, which is prayer as a way of connecting to something that's larger than yourself. And you talked about your community and sort of the broader world. For me, a key part of prayer is surrender, in the sense that I'm super type A. I am constantly trying to like curate and design my life in very intentional ways, the ways I spend my time. And I think there is a potent spiritual practice in surrendering our control over our destiny, our future, our lives, right? That there's this sense that like, yeah, you can be super micromanaged and intentional, and there are things that are outside our control. That is like a core part of prayer, of basically just saying like, whether you believe that there's like a person or like a human-like force in the world that is sort of pulling the strings behind the curtain, or if you're just like, listen, like there is like a sort of broader universe out there, and I'm just like surrendering my control over this, like that actually feels like like to me personally, and I imagine other people who are very type A, like that actually is like a very important spiritual practice. And so saying that like there is something greater out there that is beyond my control, like that actually feels very necessary for my nervous system, for my psychological well-being, to like admit that I don't have control over something. And again, like praying as if there is no God listening, another way of describing that is an exercise in surrender. Like I'm articulating the things that I don't have control over, and naming that I don't have control over them feels like a very salient spiritual practice.
So I want to say, first of all, that I basically agree and am in search of everything that you've been describing. I mean, some people might not think that, but I actually feel like if I came to a high holiday experience and it was delivering on the kind of things that you're talking about, I would be very satisfied. I believe in a lot of spiritual kind of woo-woo things. I just don't like to call them God, things of that nature. So the two similes or examples that are coming to mind, and I think both of them are problematic, but I'm trying to navigate my way through them. One is to the dawn of scientific medicine, where prior to that, people would have said, hey, if you're sick, you should have leeches and be bled. And then it turned out like that doesn't actually work. And then scientific medicine came along and said, hey, you should do these other things. These things actually work. And in a world where that happened, and there are other people saying, yeah, but we've always done leeches. It's like, that's how we've been doing it for thousands of years. You would say, yep, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. So that's one example.
Leech lecha, going back to Abraham.
Leech lecha, very good. And then the other thing that I have on my mind is this amazing literature class that I took in college. And I'm not a person who, if I'm just sitting there reading a book, I tend not to realize that it's a metaphor or something like that, and so I can do that when I'm talking to another person, or I can get it from a lecture from a professor or some other expert, and then I'm like, oh my God, that's amazing, and I see it all comes into focus. But I'm not the kind of person who tends to just see it on my own when I'm just sitting there reading the book, and I kind of need to be guided. And again, I'm thinking about that class. What was so amazing, I mean, I remember that we read the book Moby Dick, which I think if I was reading it on myself, I would have been like, it's a cool story about water and whales, and whatnot. But that's about all I got out of it. And when we had this amazing lectures about the metaphors, it turned it into my favorite book that I've ever read in my life. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had a professor just standing up there saying, oh, read these wonderful stories about a whale. It wouldn't have registered to me that these are metaphors. So I guess what I'm saying is that it feels to me like most of the time, and not just on the high holidays, like most of the time in synagogue, either what's going on is somebody's telling you the reason why we should do it this way is not because it's the best way to do it, but because it's the way we've always done it, or they're talking about, and the rabbi actually themselves believes that it's a metaphor, but nobody's saying it in the service. Everybody's just saying God and this and that. And maybe in the rabbi's mind, they imagine that everybody understands that it's a metaphor, but I don't think they do. So I guess I'm wondering, like, what's happening in the rabbi R&D department where they're coming up with alternative approaches, because I think there's incredible power in what could happen. And it wouldn't even have to be that much of a variation. It's just that I think it requires a little bit of extra, guidance and willingness to not just do it exactly the same way we've always done it, but really kind of, I love the idea that you were talking about having, like, say, the Kol Nidre, where we talk about the vows that we've made and then break up into fours and talk about what vows you actually did make this year that you want to rethink. Like, that would be amazing. Why doesn't that happen more often?
Yeah, I may not be the right person to answer that question because, like, I'm certainly not a conventional rabbi. I did not go to a conventional rabbinical school, and I don't have many friends who are conventional rabbis. Like my friends are all sort of like asking these questions, but I've basically started a tradition now where, like, every high holidays, I give my sermon about God. And I kind of joked, being like, the first time I did that, I was like, I'm going to talk about a topic that is really taboo, that most people would think is really inappropriate to talk about in a synagogue, that's like very disrespectful and totally irrelevant to what we're doing here. I'm going to talk about God, and everyone laughed, but then they kind of were like, like I don't want to talk about God, right? And of course, nobody wants to talk about the God, of our childhood and of the sort of medieval Christianity informed conception of God. But I think, like, it is, in my opinion, it is malpractice if a rabbi does not, particularly during high holidays, but honestly, like, it's true for any prayer service, but given that, like, so many people only come during high holidays, I think it's malpractice to not directly address, who are we praying to? Like, what is the point of prayer? What kind of God do you believe in or don't believe in? And how does that affect the words that you're reading, and like, if we're not asking that question, and if a rabbi is not offering resonant answers to those questions, it's all a farce. Like, what, like it's all, or I want to say it's all farce, because we talked about earlier in the conversation, like, it's, it's nostalgia, it's a pretense for meeting up with your friends. Like, they're it's community building. Like, yes, there are other reasons to do this stuff in a way that doesn't get to the resonance of it. But if you're there to have a meaningful spiritual experience, if you don't ask those questions, then, like, you're going through the motions.
I've said many, many times that if I had my dream universe and could just, like, distill this 10 days to a few things, it would be the shofar service. I love shofar. I love what you were talking about with, like, the Torah verses that just boil down to making sort of sacred noise. I would keep the beautiful Torah and Haftorah readings that I think absolutely tie to some fundamental forms of human emotion and heartbreak, commitment to justice. I'd keep those. And then the last one, and this is what I want to ask you about, is Tashlich, is the ritual. Basically, I can't prove this, but my sense of how this went down historically, and there is a little bit of evidence on this front, is that there were Jews around who were kind of saying, there's all this stuff about atonement and teshuva, and there's all these things, and, in the Torah, there's stuff about putting your sins into a goat, and then in the liturgy, there's stuff about atoning for our sins in X, Y, or Z way. We got, cool story, bro. We're going to put our sins into bread and throw it in the water. Do this very tangible action that makes a kind of ritual sense. I'm not saying metaphysically it makes a ton of sense to, like, take our misdeeds and put them in bread and throw them in the water, or put them in, I don't use bread anymore because I've learned that it harms the fish, but like putting it into something that you would then literally throw. Like, tashlich kind of means throw or send away, cause to be let go. It's the same verb root as let my people go. So you're causing the bread to be let go. And I think that people were doing that because it's just like, okay, we've got this hours of liturgy. We could just put this in the bread, throw it in the water, do an actual embodied act, and boom, we're set. And I find it very meaningful to do that. I especially find it meaningful when it's in a setting that is partially collective. So like we might sing a short thing together, might say a small bit of liturgy, but then we're like at a nice river or a lake and we consider what our sins are, we launch them in, and then we come together again at the close because I don't want it to be fully individualist. But it takes like 10 minutes. I love Tashlich. And because it's one of the pieces of high holidays that almost as a norm takes place outside of synagogue, my closing question is, how might we learn from that practice? And to the degree that Chochmat Halev or you, as you, have thought of other kinds of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur practices that happen outside of the service, because I love what you said about it's not just the service, but like, how might we think beyond the synagogue walls, beyond the 4-hour walls or 3-hour walls of the time period, to think about other ways of channeling ritual on those days to achieve the purposes we want to?
Ah, what a great question. I have so many thoughts. So just to kind of tie back some of the threads that we've been talking about up until now, that I think embodiment is really important, right? That it's not just things that happen cerebrally, that we kind of sit there and intellectually decide, like, what is no longer serving us? Like, what are the things that we've been holding onto this year that are like actually weighing us down? What are the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves that like may not be true? What are the messages that we've taken on from our parents, from society, from our peers, from our employers? Like, what do we need to let go of? What resentments and anger is no longer serving us? Like, we can make a list of that, but the fact that then we have this ritual where you actually take that and you let it go feels like it's meaningful. It's an embodied and it's somatic in a way that like science shows that actually like changes the way that our neurons fire when we actually like do things in an embodied way rather than in an intellectual way. And I want to come back to what you were saying about shofar and how we might do things differently at Chokhmat. We had this really fascinating opportunity last year because Rosh Hashanah occurred on Shabbat last year. And there is a section of the Talmud that says that when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, you don't blow the shofar. And it was like, how the heck do you have Rosh Hashanah without blowing the shofar? You know, and particularly like people are coming, the kids are coming, you know, they're counting down when like the Tekiah Gedola is, you know, who can get the longest Tekiah Gedola? Like, how can we like shofar is like one of the few things that is associated with the service itself around Rosh Hashanah. And an idea that came from Reb Zalman, who's the founder of Jewish Renewal, he had this idea, which we ended up doing at Chokhmah, is that instead of blowing the shofar, let's do a primal scream. Or actually, we just like everybody just screams at the top of their lungs at the time when we're supposed to blow the shofar. And holy shit, it was so powerful when we do that. Like literally the walls felt like they were shaking. And it's like, yeah, the shofar is supposed to, the ram's horn is supposed to remind you of the voice of someone crying. Yeah, if you really kind of like squint your ears and like get yourself in the mindset of that metaphor, you can kind of think of it as someone crying. But the visceral experience you feel in your body, not only of yourself just letting out this scream, but being full of a room full of people that are screaming, like it was one of the most powerful Rosh Hashanah experiences I've had, and like really embodied that sense of like angst and yearning that I think we're trying to get to. Sometimes words just don't get us there. And like now it's like, okay, Rosh Hashanah this year is not on Shabbat. I'm like, I'm bringing that back. Like we're going to do that for like one of our shofar blasts there. And so I do think whether it's Tashlich, whether it, you know, and again, like I kind of got to this earlier when I was talking about Tashlich. Like for me, it's not about like getting rid of your sins, like, oh, put them in bread, boom, like my sins are away. Like I think like, I don't know, I don't actually like believe in this concept of sin in the sort of like Christian sense of the word. But I do think in this idea, going back to this concept of surrender, there's like surrendering your control over things, but there's surrendering the things that no longer serve us. Like if Rosh Hashanah is this one time a year where we actually reflect, we do cheshbon hanefesh, we do an audit of our souls, and we reflect on what is not serving us, how do we want to be our best selves, how do we want to live our lives? A big part of that is consciously surrendering the things that don't serve us, the relationships that aren't serving us, the messages that aren't serving us. That embodied sense of letting things go, I feel like is feels different than just like either like a sermon or a teaching. And I think like, let's not forget, like we're here talking about the high holidays, like let's not forget like fasting on Yom Kippur. Like I love fasting. I fast for all 7 days. There's 7 fast days over the course in the Jewish year, major fasts and minor fasts. I fast for all of them because it's so embodied. It's so different from the rest of Judaism, which is so intellectual and cerebral. Like, I like the practices that actually get me into my body and that give me a visceral or somatic experience of something rather than a cerebral experience. Bring back the like embodied rituals of Judaism and get out of the like boring prayer book in your lap, suit and tie, stand up, sit down, responsive reading. Like, there's so much more in Judaism for us to play with.
What a cool, amazing note to end on. A quick thing for your community and for others listening. What you did with that primal scream, it actually harkens back to something you said about how teruah, the word that we tie to shofar, it's not clear that it actually means to blow a shofar. It's just like day of noise making. The Karaites understood the phrase Yom Teruah as meaning a day of shouting. There's a few texts, including in the book of Joshua, that use teruah as basically that primal scream that you talked about. So I actually think there's a way in which you're like channeling a deeply traditional understanding of what this day is for. And may we all do that and our own new innovative ways of celebrating the days as well. So thank you, Zvika, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
My pleasure. So fun to be able to reimagine what a meaningful high holiday experience could be like.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. 2 reminders. We've got Elul Unbound. The month of Elul just started. It's the final month of the Jewish calendar year, and it also serves as the kind of on-ramp month into the next year. Elul Unbound is our annual initiative where we market together. You can join our email list at judaismunbound.com/ELUL. You can find out about our upcoming Shabbat gatherings, listen to our bonus mini podcast here on this feed related to Elul, all that great stuff to continue what we started in this conversation on ramping into this high holiday season. And the second shout out, we have amazing courses, mini courses in the Anya Shiva coming. We've got 4 3-session mini courses. They are going to be awesome. And 1 full semester course, Judaism Inbound. That is our Intro to Judaism class. And you can learn about all of those at judaismunbound.com/classes. You can register there. There's financial aid available for all of them. We don't want finances to be a barrier to any of our learning. And you can learn more, again, at judaismunbound.com/classes. We will close out this episode in the same way we always do by encouraging you to be in touch with us. We love getting your notes, your questions, your arguments, whatever you've got. Please be in touch. There's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. There's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode, related links, all sorts of goodies. And there's our email addresses. Send us a note at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We love hearing from you. The last request we'd like to make is that we deeply appreciate when you're able to support our work financially, which makes a huge difference in helping us continue to provide all of this work for free. And you can do that at judaismunbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just via a one-time gift. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.